So before I begin, I do want to thank the two previous speakers. Kalihi, mahalo for reminding me that I should be proud that my name is Nicole Alana Toshiko Kaulana Okau'i Melin Velasco. Each one just as essential as the next. And to Josh, thank you so much for your courage to stand up here to share your story, share your mana'o, and to remind me that, and actually everyone here tonight, that we do need to be cognizant of the time that we have. So tonight I actually would like to dedicate my portion of TEDx to my parents, to my friends, to all of you, but also to the late kindred spirit of mine, Don Gordon. Once upon a time, in a tropical paradise quite like this one, a young woman found herself surrounded by family and friends on one of the most exciting nights of her life, Election Night 2012. It was a quaint affair at her grandmother's home. There was food and drink, laughter and merriment, but when the clock struck for the results to be read, all fell silent. Upon the first reading, the young woman's numbers were quite dismal. But then the second reading came and her tally shot up. The air was electric with the possibility that this young woman who dared might achieve a newcomer's triumph against an incumbent veteran that had been in office longer than she had been alive. And then the third and final reading of the election results. The young woman who dared 1,116 votes. Lord of the ballot, 1,136 votes. By a mere 120 votes, the young woman who dared lost. But as the saying goes, it's the journey and not the destination. And the journey that brings us full circle to election night actually begins in the city that never sleeps. Back in 2009, just after graduating from college, the young woman moved to the Big Apple to be a producer at an audio post-production house. She loved the city, the food, the arts, the culture, the people, the energy. But one day, whilst clacking away in her cushy Midtown office, the young woman received an email from her dear friend Brian. At the time, Brian was in Kazakhstan teaching business classes at a local university. And in his spare time, Brian was studying large public works projects in restrictive locations with limited resources. And it just so happened that the young woman's home state was in the throes of one such project. Brian was reading all about it in the local newspapers. But the email that Brian sent did not include an article about the project. Instead, the email included a link to an article about Furlough Fridays. Now, upon reading this article about Furlough Fridays, the young woman was beside herself with grief. She could not believe that in a state where the public education system was already struggling, that the budgetary solution was to cut Friday from the school schedule. She was enraged, but when she calmed herself, she read the rest of Brian's email, which had just a very, very simple note. Time to go home. That's all it said. Time to go home. It was then, at that moment, that the young woman realized that she would have to leave the big city, the glitz and the glamour, and move back home to help. Now, when she told her close friends, they thought she was crazy. Leave the big city, go back to the Rock? What was she possibly going to do there? And although the young woman did not know the what, she knew the why. And that was to help and to serve her home state. So she decided during the last few months in the big city that she would develop a music collaboration program for public school students. She went through the East Coast and she recruited schools in New York, DC, Boston, and New Jersey. Then she went to the West Coast and recruited a school in the Bay Area. And for an added global touch, she recruited a music school in Thailand. As you can imagine, she could not wait to finally get home to recruit local public schools. But when she arrived back in her home state in the late 2010, she was stymied by the education bureaucracy. She could not even get the first form, to get the second form, to get the third form, just to call the schools. She lamented her situation to a family friend and mentor. "How is this so hard?" she told him. "Ah," he said, "you're upset with the status quo. You need to go and learn a little bit more about the system." His recommendation came with the advice to go and get a job with the Finance Committee of the House with the state representatives. So, for the first time ever, the young woman who dared went to the state capitol, interviewed for a job, and was hired in 2011. Now, during the legislative session that year, the young woman sat in committee hearings, info briefings, leadership caucuses, and backdoor discussions. And the young woman realized that the adage really is true, that lawmaking is a lot like making sausage. You don't want to know what goes into it. Now, one day, the finance committees used to be really, really, really long, and the hearing had a recess at about 11 p.m. midnight. So the young woman went out to the rail to get a breath of fresh air and to relax a little bit. It turned out that one of her friends was still in the building, and he came up to her to say hi and to ask her what she was going to do at the end of the session in May. I'm going to move to that city by the bay with the Golden Gate Bridge, and I'm going to do yoga for the rest of my life, she said. What? Said her friend. But I thought you moved home to help. Well, I did, but I really don't think there's anything I can do here, she confessed. Now, while her friend understood what she meant, he disagreed with her assumption that there wasn't anything that she could do, and he told her that perhaps her frustrations would be the catalyst for the change that she sought. That is, if she stuck around. So, at the end of the session in May, the young woman decided that she would stay. And then she found herself a little job at the state auditor's office. And it was there that she thought, this is it. This is where I make my contribution. This is where I dig through the institutional mire and do performance and management audits and change the world. But then soon the young woman realized that not a whole lot of people actually read the audit reports. And as this frustration brewed within her, after doing all this hard work on these reports and nobody to read them, an unusual fork in the road appeared. News had spread throughout the land that the representative in the young woman's district was leaving the seat to run for another office. Shortly thereafter, one of her friends called. Hey, have you heard? I think you should do it. Maybe this is your chance. Maybe this is how you make your contribution. Initially, the idea made the young woman absolutely sick to her stomach. She had no political acumen, no campaign experience, and no clue where to possibly begin. But then several other friends called and suggested the same thing. Maybe this was an opportunity. Maybe this is a risk that she should take. So she consulted her family. Surprisingly, they said yes. And then with the support of her friends, the young woman decided that she would enter the dark forest of political campaigns. Now, if we were to discuss all the twists and turns and bumps and bruises and characters that the young woman encountered in this extremely dark forest, this night would take us well into next year's election. So for all of your listening pleasure, here are some key stories that demonstrate just how truly dark it was in the forest. The lady who refused. The young woman realized that to be an official candidate on the ballot, she would need to get signatures on her nomination papers from neighbors in the district. So one day, she went outside, took a stroll, and came upon a lovely brick house. And there was a lady watering her plants. The young woman approached the lady, introduced herself, and told her that she was running for office to do some good. The lady was extremely excited about this. She was happy that a female was vying for a leadership role, and she was very pleased that a young person was committed to public service. Also happy to find a supporter, the young woman asked the lady if she would sign her nomination papers. The lady took the pen to paper with gusto without a problem. She filled out her social security number. She put her address down without a hitch. But when it came to filling out her name and signing on the dotted line, the lady stopped dead in her tracks. "Will he see this?" said the lady. Will who see this?" said the young woman. "Lord of the ballot." The young woman realized what was happening at this moment, and she explained to the lady that if he so chose, Lord of the ballot could actually see the document as it would become public. But then she told the lady that if she were to fill out her name and sign on the dotted line, that she would be standing in solidarity with every other person on those nomination papers who thought that we deserved that change. Despite her best efforts, the young woman could not convince the lady, and the lady shoved the paper and pen back at her and proceeded to walk away. And as the lady stormed away, the young woman, curious, called out and said, "But what would happen if he saw your name?" The lady stopped, turned softly, and said, "He would come to my house." A dog in a corner. During the campaign, the young woman held a very strict regimen of the ever-important activity of sign waving in a major intersection from 6 a.m. to 8 a.m. So one morning, just like any other morning, the young woman woke up and went out to sign wave. To her surprise, Lord of the Ballot was actually awake, and his team was out there to sign wave as well. But Lord of the Ballot was not happy. "You have no class," said Lord of the Ballot to the young woman. She thought, maybe today we go home, maybe today we retreat. And as she was deciding what to do, Lord of the Ballot also told her, "You can't learn class in school, you can only learn class in politics." It was then that the young woman thought, we should go home. So as she turned around to walk away, her friend said, "No, you stand your ground, you get out there, and you wave." So, meekly and a little disinterested, the young woman stayed out there and waved. Now, the Saturday that followed that contentious sidewalk experience began like any other. The young woman and her family went out to the farmer's market to pick up their veggies and mingle with the neighbors. So as they were walking about, one of the old men who was a frequent person at the farmer's market came up to the young woman and said, "Don't back a dog into a corner." Plain naive, but knowing full well what the man meant, the young woman said, "Well, sir, what do you mean?" The old man leaned closer, lowered his gaze, and told the young woman, "You don't want to end up like your relative." Now, the relative that the old man is referring to is a distant relative of the young woman, a distant relative who was a former mayor in a small town in the Philippines who was shot dead in cold blood. As you can imagine, the young woman was spooked, scared, and she began to think that there might be an easier way to get a job, that maybe this isn't such a good idea and she should just call it quits and go home. But as she was doubting herself, she returned back to the question, "If not you, then who?" It rang through her ears. And she realized that she would have to go through this, that she would have to go through all of this crazy, wacky stuff in order to demonstrate to her community that they need not be fearful of leadership. A statistical aberration. Now, as we all well know, in the end, the young woman who dared lost the election. And the next day, a little relieved and extremely tired, the young woman decided that she was going to go to the beach to relax, but also to fix the terrible farmer's tan that she procured from walking the district in the hot summer sun for 6 months. So she went to the beach. It was gorgeous. She laid out her mat, and as she was about to lay down for the rest of the day, her phone started to ring off the hook. The first, second, and third time she screened it, but by the fourth and the fifth, she thought maybe I should actually pick it up. And when she did, it was her friend on the other line, a lawyer and a little bit of a political junkie, and her friend said, "Have you seen the numbers?" "Well, no, I'm at the beach." "Something is wrong. Something is actually really wrong. You beat him in every precinct by walk-in and mail except for precinct 2 only by mail. Something is wrong." "Okay, I'm gonna look into it." Shortly thereafter, a statistician from a local university contacted the young woman to tell her that her loss was a statistical aberration, and that according to his analysis, she should have never lost. As she digested that, the young woman thought, well, that sucks. So she was slowly coming to terms with what was happening, and then all of a sudden, a local online news media outlet published a story about a family that was very upset, a family that had alleged claims that Lord of the Ballot one day visited their home and helped their grandmother fill out her absentee ballot. All of a sudden, the political scene was abuzz with malfeasance. Lawyers, both known and unknown to the young woman, approached her with briefs in hand saying, pull the trigger, sue, complain, and pursue your opponent. The young woman surveyed all the different options, but in not one single option could she find something that was very important to her. None of these courses of action would actually create the systemic change that she thought was necessary. They were merely symptomatic. So, in the end, and much to the chagrin of her supporters, the young woman who dared decided not. The bill. Several months after the whole thing started to settle down, the young woman was quite relieved. No more was the phone ringing off the hook. No more were there urges to sue her opponent. But just as things got back to normal, the 2013 legislative session began, and the young woman received some very interesting news about a brand new bill that was introduced for the first time ever in the state. It turns out that this bill was written in direct response to the alleged claims raised in the young woman's campaign. And this bill, among other provisions, would prohibit candidates and their agents from assisting voters with filling out mail-in ballots. When the young woman heard this, she thought maybe there is hope, that maybe from the ash of defeat, this bill now manifest would finally protect our voters. But of course, as we all know in politics, things get dirty. And so the bill became highly political, and it was slated not to survive. In fact, after first crossover, it suffered a swift death in the Senate. But, like political magic, it came back to life in another bill, made it through second crossover, made it through conference, made it through final decade, and on to the governor's desk, where, on June 27, 2013, it was signed into law. Now, Act 235 exists as another way to protect our voters, our citizens, from performing their basic duties and rights. So, the moral of this story is that it really is the journey and not the destination, that it really is about you finding yourself in a situation where something needs to be done, where an action needs to be taken, where you simply can't sit back and be idle and watch it play out right before your eyes. And when you find yourself in that situation, by all means, I hope you dare to do the right thing. Because you never know. You never know the contribution you were meant to make. And you never know, if you don't try, the impact you may have on your community. Now, of course, like the young woman, you might doubt yourself. You might think, maybe I'm not the right person. Maybe I shouldn't be doing this. Maybe I should just go home. Maybe I should retreat. And as you're asking yourselves those questions, ask yourself just one more question. If not you, then who? Thank you.